Lori, and I am really grateful to have the chance to speak to all of you. So, thanks to all of you for tuning in today to hear about some of the work that we're pushing forward in butterfly conservation at the Xerces Society. And I know that Sharon was just talking to you, and many of you have probably had the chance to hear about Xerces. I just wanted to point out my humble role is within our endangered species program, and Sharon and Emily May, who will be talking tomorrow, are in our amazing pesticide reduction team. And some of you probably also interact with our agricultural biodiversity staff, and we have wonderful community engagement and policy folks as well. And I just like to point out their amazing work that they do as well. So my name is Kevin. I am a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society. I grew up in Northeast Ohio, but I am one of those Western transplants. I moved to Northwestern Nevada in the Reno area in 2007, and I've lived in this area ever since. And so much of my butterfly work, almost all of it, has focused on the Western United States and Nevada and California and other Western habitats. And I love to travel around between the deserts and the mountains and explore and document butterfly diversity, rare and common. And I get to do some of that work with the Xerces Society, which I am honored to do. So the report and the work that underlies both the scientific publications and the public publications that I'm going to talk about are the product of one group of people that were interested in understanding butterfly population trends across the country. Of course, there are many others, and as late as 2023, we had some varied regional evidence that some, though certainly not all, butterfly species were declining in at least some places. We were gathering this regional evidence that suggested that there might be some sort of declining hotspots, but there were many regions for which analyses had not been done, certainly at a species level, although many more have been done, accounting for things like insect biomass or general abundance studies. And probably at this point, the most important thing I can say about the analyses and the scientific publications that resulted from this working group is that it involved an amazing set of investigators, including Cheryl Schultz and Elizabeth Crone, Wayne Thogmartin of the USGS. And I should also note that this work was supported by a USGS grant USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service funding, and the USGS Powell Center hosted our working group meetings, along with an enormous group of scientists that are passionate about understanding butterfly biology, butterfly population trends, and contributing to conservation. And the data that underlie these analyses that I'm talking about come from a real diverse set of sites, and they include things that might be single species transects, focusing on endangered or imperiled species on particularly important sites like military bases, as an example. They also include things that might be more well-known, like the North American Butterfly Association 4th of July counts or annual butterfly counts that occur once a year and are kind of a point count analysis. They include an expanding database of repeated transect surveys under the Pollard-based program. And so we have this huge array of surveys, and it is certainly, I think, the largest data set on insect population trends that we have for North America. I am open to other people pointing out other things that have been going on for longer because I like knowing that sort of thing. But as far as I know, this represents one of the larger collections of data for this type of analysis. And it is a lot, but of course, it's also very different. There's different times of year, different regions and sites, different types of observer effort and program survey methods, as I just mentioned in some of these different transects that have been done. And so we did our best to account for these different types of variables. And of course, you're welcome to investigate what types of analyses we did in that publication. I'm not going to go into depth about that now. there are, as you would expect, trade-offs to this sort of large-scale analysis that don't give you the sort of insight as to if you were working on a bespoke model for a particular species. So, of course, there are trade-offs. But in general, we wanted to look at how the total of abundance of butterflies is changing across the contiguous United States, how the abundance of each various species was changing, and we looked at the national level to answer these questions, and then we also did regional analyses dividing up these monitoring sites by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service region. So a geographical division that makes some sense in some cases and not as much sense in other cases, and I'll give you examples of that. So at the risk of glossing over and just pretending like a lot of the analyses are self-evident, I'm going to skip to the results. And I'm going to say that butterflies did, in fact, have declined across the country. There is an overall decline across the country of 22% in total butterfly abundance, which is essentially for every 5 butterflies that were present in 2000, there were 4 present in 2020, which is the scale of our analysis was from 2000 to 2020. And you can see in this map as well that there is a fair amount of variation between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regions in the decline in abundance, varying from 3 or 4% in some portions of the country to over 30% in the desert Southwest, a region that has already received a fair bit of attention for its biodiversity declines. And in general, the other main result here, when we looked at the trends of particular species for which there were roughly 270 something, I believe, where we had enough data to divide them up into the region in which they occur or regions in which they occur, you can see that very few species are increasing in diversity, and that there is also a clump of species that seem to be very much increasing in abundance by estimates of 100% or more. But I think the point is that they are absolutely increasing in abundance. But for every one of those species, there are many more that are declining. And some of these appear to be declining in the last 20 years at a substantial rate of several percent a year, leading to declines of 60 or 70% in these estimates of these analyses. So the staff at the Xerces Society, including myself, Candace Fallon, Scott Black, our director, and a variety of folks who have been in the working group. I would highlight out Cheryl Schultz, and I would also highlight Erica Henry, who's now at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and with input from most others in the working group. We decided that we wanted to create a public-facing product that would take these results and create something actionable from them, and would create something that was easy for the public to digest, but specifically folks who manage lands that have or could have butterflies, which is obviously a huge array of folks, including most of you here at this talk today, which is why I am excited to talk about this a little bit more. So one thing that I want to highlight that might be rather obvious is that we created a set of pages that just focus on the results of these analyses for each U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service region. So depending on what part of the Midwest or Upper Midwest or Great Plains states or Intermountain West you find yourself in, you can sort through these pages and find a couple examples of species that are increasing or decreasing, along with a kind of general understanding of what's contained in the analyses. And then we also have a set of detailed charts that go through these species and the rates of decline found in these analyses, as well as the geographic distribution of these species by state, so that managers who are looking at these lists have an understanding of what butterflies could possibly be found in their area and which ones are not. And so here's a separate example of the Midwest U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service region, which is some definition of the Midwest, and a different set of species, both as highlights and on our list of decliners. And also with each one of these regions, we try to give examples of success stories of conservation so that we have inspiration and that there's recognition that these butterflies can be the subject of real conservation attention. So I wanted to take a second and just highlight two, I dare say, almost random species that I have picked from these lists of species in decline for these two different regions, just to show you the surprising nature of some of these results, and then help me lead into some potential causes of these declines. So just as an example, one skipper species is the long dash, Pallades mystic. It is widespread across the upper Great Plains, Midwest, and Northeast, and it feeds on grass as caterpillars. So nothing in what I have said there makes it a conventional target for conservation attention in any way. But the evidence from these long-term monitoring sites shows it declining by 9% a year in mountain prairie region sites, and up almost 5% a year in the Midwest, almost 3% a year at Northeast monitoring sites. And again, all of this is between 2000 and 2020. And this, especially despite appearing to spread as a species in the suburban West. This is a species that is documented as apparently increasing in portions of the suburban West. I'm guessing locations like Denver, although I could be wrong about that. And yet we find it declining at many monitoring sites. A second species, one of my favorite species, partly just because I like things that eat nettles. This is a butterfly that eats nettles as caterpillars and is widespread again across the West Upper Great Plains, the Midwest, and the Northeast. And this is a species that has been found to be declining between these 2 decades in multiple regions, as you can see here, including extensive declines estimated in the Northeast. And I think what this points to is, even if you find some of these numbers to be, dare we say, unbelievable, the fact that they are shared across such wide geographic areas suggests that we should be paying attention to the declines of this species, right? This is nothing if not a series of red flags. And what you do with red flags is, of course, up to you. You can believe them or not. You can investigate what they mean or not. And so it's useful to think about what might be causing these sorts of declines. And so, again, these sorts of declines in widespread species that are typically considered among some of the most common of butterflies is shocking for many and confusing, especially for individuals who have observed and studied butterflies for a long time. They do, to give these results, does in some sense beg an explanation. But the study that I have been describing, the Edwards et al. Science paper in 2025, does not address these causes really at all in its analyses. So I don't want to spend an enormous amount of time discussing causes of decline, as Tara has done such a great job earlier. And my colleague Emily May is going to be talking more about threats to monarchs tomorrow. But I do think it is worth a quick summary, because first, in order to build a roadmap to recovery, we need to know what threats we are addressing, obviously. And also because I want to highlight that some of these threats have overwhelming evidence as causes of decline for butterflies, and they are things that do not take a stretch of the imagination to believe that they could be affecting some of these widespread and formerly common species. The first among these, and possibly the most well-documented, is the loss and fragmentation of butterfly habits. I'm not going to harp on this to a set of individuals from the Midwest. Certainly, individuals in the Western United States where I live have a harder time believing that habitats can be fragmented and lost, though, of course, they are heavily degraded in my area by things like the annual cheatgrass invasion. But also, we tend to fragment our habitats in the West by covering them with things that farm the sun rather than things that farm crops, right? So we have different types of threats that do have the same sorts of results in the Western United States. This example map that I have here is for the regal fritillary, which had its species status assessment done recently, proposed to be listed as threatened for the western subspecies and endangered for the eastern subspecies. And one of the main causes that is listed in its species status assessment as causes of its decline include grassland conversion, primarily due to agriculture. And then other causes, just to mention it, are herbicides, drought, invasive grasses, periodic disturbances from fire and grazing, and climate change factors. You're going to hear more of those terms in these coming slides, and you've already heard some of them already from Tara and Sharon. So again, I don't want to harp on things that Sharon has already talked about, and I don't want to scoop my colleague Emily May, but I do want to point out, of course, pesticide application is a topic many of us are familiar with. The point that I want to make that is just so relevant here is that these chemicals that are sprayed can be found far from their likely application sources, despite the vast majority of applicators following label instructions, or certainly are well-intentioned in following label instructions. And so I want to give examples of the fact that this is happening to show that it definitely can be a contributor to these widespread butterfly declines. So I'm going to very quickly go over these first two studies, and if I can promise anything, it'll be that if there's any repeated material, Emily May will do a better job of explaining it tomorrow than I am today. This 2020 study was looking at contamination of milkweeds across the California Central Valley, including near agricultural sites, but also in state wildlife refuges. And what you can see from this chart, where you have each individual chemical as a column, and the rows are various sites divided up to agricultural sites, refuge sites, and urban sites. I'll ignore the retail, that short set of rows in the middle upper portion there. What you can see is that there's a wide array of insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides that are present on these plants. And the one that I will point out in particular is this chlorantraniliprole, which is used on caterpillars, beetles, and aphids on a wide range of commodity crops. And it was found above lethal concentrations for monarchs at multiple refuge sites. So in sites far from the application of pesticides, you're finding lethal concentrations of these chemicals on the plants that the caterpillars are exposed to in the wild. This was over 227 leaf samples from 19 different sites. Another study that, as did the last study I just talked about, involves Xerces Society staff, collected numerous species of Lepidoptera caterpillar food plants in urban parts of Sacramento, California, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, which are obviously both large cities, but they have very distinct surrounding landscapes. And you can see again where each chemical is a column in these two graphs here. You can see that the various chemicals are widespread. And I'll point out this chemical here, which I'm not going to pronounce at the moment. Forgive me. Methoxyphenicide, I think, but Sharon will correct me if I'm wrong. That's okay. That is a chemical that, as far as the California state pesticide database is concerned, is only used in agricultural settings. And yet this chemical was found in almost every sample that was taken in the urban portion of Sacramento, California. So that's an extremely disturbing finding, suggesting that some of these chemicals are likely spreading very far from their sources. One last study that I just want to highlight for widespread butterflies here, although some of them are not as widespread as they once were. This last study does not involve Xerces staff. It was completed by Eric Runquist and colleagues at the Minnesota Zoo and involved collecting grass tissue and soil samples from designated critical habitats of the Poweshiek skipperling and the Dakota skipper. And these sites are also home to the regal fritillary. There were 4 sites in Minnesota and 1 in South Dakota. And in this instance, each of the chemicals is a row, and each of the columns you can see there's 5 different sites that were sampled either in the early season or the late season, and each group of these columns is for a given year. And the columns on the left side show the concentrations of these chemicals in parts per billion. The columns on the right side show the percent of samples that contained that chemical. And most of these will be grass ones. And so you can see the very top row there is chlorpyrifos, and this is an organophosphate for soybean aphid. And they found that chlorpyrifos quantities were higher at sites where both of these endangered species have been extirpated in the past. So a disturbing correlation. Just one note that comes along with this sort of study. Recently, the EPA did complete and release its final insecticide strategy to deal with its Endangered Species Act obligations, which is obviously designed specifically to address this type of issue. I'm going to defer to my pesticide colleagues to discuss any of the details of this, but I know there are some significant shortcomings in this plan in addressing this sort of widespread contamination. One thing that's not highlighted in this graph here is that they found these concentrations did not vary whether the grass was sampled adjacent to an agricultural field or from the interior of the site, which is restricted from application. So again, there's no real variation depending on distance here. Climate change, yet another topic that has already been touched on, so I don't want to really discuss it too much here, except that we are really getting evidence that in the desert Southwest, this is driving insect declines. There's correlations with changes in fall precipitation and increases in temperature that suggest that these extended fall seasons that are particularly dry appear to be one of the main stressors for butterfly populations in that particular region. And so I think, what I would highlight here simply is that it's hard at times to show the real effect of climate change on insect populations. And this is one particular instance where the regional effects are particularly compelling. The last thing that I want to highlight here, and I'm going to block that side of this graph out, which is from a 2023 paper that Matt Forrester and myself and other colleagues were involved with, looking at butterfly declines in the Western United States. These graphs here represent a set of sites that have been monitored by Art Shapiro at the University of California in Davis, many of them since the 70s. And he has gone out every other week and he records simply whether butterflies are present or absent by species, whether butterflies are present or absent at that site. And the sites that he goes to are along the Interstate 80 corridor of Central California. And again, he's done it every other week through the growing season at these sites and in almost every site since the 70s or 80s. So these sites are color-coded here. And again, this figure represents on the left, the coast. On the bottom figure there is the Coast Range, the Central Valley low sites, and then the Sierra Nevada Range on the right. And the sites are color-coded by graphs. Each graph here, the y-axis is showing you the percentage of sites where a percentage of visits for which a butterfly was present. So if that number is at 1, it was there every single time Art went there. If it's at 0.5, he saw it every other visit. And if it's at 0, he never saw it through that entire season. And for all of these, year is on the x-axis. This is the large marble butterfly. And this is an example of a butterfly that has declined or been extirpated at almost every single site that it is monitored at. And this includes the Central Valley, where we have widespread pesticide contamination, as well as places like Castle Peak, one of the most diverse butterfly sites in the country, and definitely not a site with widespread pesticide contamination. So there is an ongoing question as to what is causing these correlated declines at both high and low elevation sites. And I think the ongoing hypothesis that we talk about over drinks at dinner is the idea that the butterflies are or would be moving between these sites. There's a good bit of documented natural history evidence that butterflies, specifically in the California Central Valley, tend to move upslope up the Sierras in the hot summer months. And the fact that these butterflies are being decimated in the Central Valley is essentially removing the source of the metapopulation dynamics that feed the mountain populations through the summer. At least this is the idea. I don't think this is a revolutionary idea, but I do think it helps us understand why we have butterfly declines in places where we wander around and we see butterflies, and we also don't see the threats as being as obvious to us. Okay, so on to something hopefully positive. The goal of the second half of our public report is to address really the harder part of all of this, the roadmap for moving forward. And so we have a couple chapters on this in our report. And the pie in the sky, I think you can all agree, is bringing back butterfly populations from these 20, 30, 50% declines. Something that to me feels remarkably doable thanks to the general ability of insect populations to boom under the right conditions. So I think that it may take us a couple or 3 decades to do it, but it definitely seems like something that if we all put our heads together, the butterflies will let us do it. I think we can work together. And so in this sort of vision, we have all of these different species accounted for in our lands management across landscapes, including both common species like the Milbert's tortoiseshell or the red admiral that we know are declining, but also rarer species like the regal fritillary or the Carner blue, things we're already working on in very particular locations. As many of you must know, many of the techniques for conserving these very distinct species may actually be very much the same, protecting vulnerable or declining habitats, maintaining native plant diversity, and restricting pesticide exposure. And just like this kind of coalition of the willing has been done rather successfully with the monarch over the last decades, we need to work all of these various species into the minds and the documents of people who manage these landscapes. Thus far, I know that those of us that think about butterflies specifically may do more, but in general, a lot of pollinator conservation in the broad sense focuses on nectar plants. But with additional action, we can lead to a broader understanding of actions that will really affect butterfly conservation as a group of species. So in this report, we break down different landscapes and different actions that can be taken. And we focus also, we have a section on collaborative elements that span these different landscapes. And at the very end of this report, we also have an appendix where the actions are listed and we kind of document which landscapes various actions can apply to. So we kind of try to cross-reference these actions in 2 different ways. So one example I just want to focus on here is incorporating imperiled species biology and the names of these species, the lists of these species, the understanding that they're in decline into planning processes. So just examples of locations, and I'm assuming you might think of your own work here, whether you work at a state wildlife refuge, whether you work at a county or regional park, or something slightly less obvious, whether you know of or are participating in a homeowners association board. All of these different agencies have planning documents that are associated with them. And just like this has been done with the monarch, where now people at times just by default include the monarch in planning processes, we can do that with these other species where they're applicable. Another kind of related component of including things in a planning process is broadening what species we include in things like wildlife inventories for land trusts or other agencies, state wildlife agencies, that may have in the past only been documenting or inventorying some of the rarer species. So including both the plants and the butterflies as these products that add biodiversity value to specific locations. This is something that I think in a mindset and in documents you can lay explicit value to. And the reason for this, as I'm sure you can recognize, is that species that make lists and get incorporated into these, some document or another, often get incorporated into broader programming. So for example, species that are listed by the State Department of Wildlife as species of greatest conservation need is a ready-made list for a regional park to look at when they're making interpretive materials. And this happens all the time. And then the last thing that I want to address in these planning documents is, of course, and just to reiterate over and over, including pesticide reduction or regulation in these documents as much as possible. Another possibly obvious feature about one way to restore declining butterflies across landscapes is to expand our habitat. But the main thing that I want to emphasize with this is just to think back on how long it has taken many of us as insect advocates to educate the public, for example, that monarchs use milkweed. And now, jokingly, tongue-in-cheek, many of us are stuck with the public understanding that all butterflies are monarchs and all butterflies use milkweed. So, of course, that's not really the case, but we need to expand public awareness to the point that these species are just as important as the monarch in our understanding of, oh yeah, I need to protect this plant because butterflies use it. This has, of course, the overall value of reinforcing the benefit of plant biodiversity on the landscape, which we're all fans of here. In addition to a broader understanding of the role of host plants and things like sites for pupation and the timing of management as ways in which we restore habitat, we again need to reinforce that reducing pesticide exposure is a crucial and necessary attribute of butterfly habitat, not something that is an optional added element. And I think at this point, this represents more of a philosophical shift in the minds of the public, where when they're thinking about the plants in the ground, they're also thinking about what is happening in the gardens and yards and turf grass environments around them. But in a separate issue, we also need to really, at a broader geographic scale, understand and then also find ways to restrict the long distance spread of pesticides across landscapes far from their application. In my mind, this is essentially removing broad swaths of the country as habitat, right? It's not really habitat if there's lethal doses of pesticides on the plants that the caterpillars are eating, and there is. I was just recently talking with a National Wildlife Federation representative from New Mexico, and he's also very passionate about this. They're finding pesticide levels in fish that are above, in waterways in New Mexico that are above safe concentrations for drinking by humans or other animals. So we are making our landscapes unsafe for habitation and consumption of the resources that are on them. And this is something that is a compelling message for many different groups. So I think it's a place where we can make real inroads. Last, and possibly the most obvious of all, as advocates for butterfly conservation, we need to involve the larger public in this project through education, accessibility, and simply lowering barriers to entry for acting in favor of butterfly conservation. Things that have already been talked about here, like iNaturalist as a tool for involving the public in data collection, habitat kits that specialize in pesticide-free plants and include all of the needed elements for a butterfly's life cycle are key examples of this that can be tailored for any area. And last but not least, I'm going to remind people again of the amazing amount of research and knowledge that's been generated because of the conservation attention paid to the monarch. We know things about field realistic levels of neonic exposure because the monarch was the subject of that, right? But that knowledge is useful for everything. And so species in decline present themselves as opportunities for research about insect biology. And we have the fact that we have so much information on butterflies means we have an additional opportunity to use them as examples of conservation success. This is the appendix I was talking about, which takes some of these actions and just kind of cross-references them to various landscapes. I just wanted to point that out because I think it's a particularly useful tool. So I just want to close and summarize what I think are the most important points here. Again, I think there is evidence and well-documented causes for butterfly decline in many species, in many places. something that we maybe have been gathering evidence for, but I think this is the conclusion that can be reached. And conservation efforts can include these species in many landscapes and help protect and restore larger areas and enrich butterfly habitats. And just like Sharon did, I want to thank all of our supporters who help facilitate this sort of presentation and much of the work that I do. And remind folks that just as you would suspect, you can also be a supporter of the Xerces Society. If you find our work inspirational, please do go to our website and donate. And then I will say thank you. And I have my email here if anyone has any questions. And I'm hoping I got just a couple minutes for questions. So thank you all very much again.
Thank you, Kevin. Wow, you really crammed it in there.
So I hope so not too much.
A lot of information, very good information, and highlights how at risk the butterflies are. And I imagine you're involved in some work along the way to help designate some butterflies at risk or threatened with the Endangered Species Act. And since there have been some changes at the federal level, can you speak to maybe how important it is that we work locally now, as you talked about?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that is an excellent point. Now, more than ever, to take a threat as an opportunity, we have the opportunity to work at the state and local levels to work on insect conservation in a way that can be very meaningful. To start with, most of us are going to interact with a state wildlife biologist long before we would interact with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist. They're our first points of contact for many different things involving urban and rural wildlife. And they own many key habitats within their state that are heritages for the citizens of their states, specifically in state wildlife refuges and similar habitats. The Xerces Society has an ongoing initiative called Insects Are Wildlife, which is specifically to address the shortcoming in about a dozen states that insects are not considered wildlife and actually can't be conserved by state wildlife biologist staff because they don't have the mandate. That includes my home state, my adopted home state of Nevada, as well as other states. And we have ongoing policy work to correct this in Nevada and other locations. So if that is something of interest, then yeah, I think that, we have an ongoing program there. But then our habitat kits, I think it's an obvious example that many of us are drawn to. A long-standing message for insect conservation is that it can be done on small scales. So having a habitat kit program that focuses on particularly underserved groups that may have barriers to entry for buying native plants that can be expensive and maybe take some special rearing protocols that we're not familiar with. I think those programs are especially meaningful.
And where can people, I know this is a big geographic challenge, but for butterflies in their geographic area, where can they find out the best type of nectar and other plants? You have some of that on the Xerces website, right?
Yeah, one of the best resources for that on our website is going to be our regional guides for plant and pollinator, regional guide for pollinator plants that has some habitat information on it along with plant lists. I think it has some Xerces staff favorites highlighted. It has other ecological trait information on there, and it's divided up by ecological region. They have a number of them available, I think, like for the Central Valley versus other parts of California, for example, but also for the Midwest and Intermountain West, all across the country. And then we also have a book that I'm not going to be able to find right now that's Gardening for Butterflies, that's published by the Xerces Society by my esteemed supervisor, Candace Fallon. And she put that together several years ago. And so that would be another great starting point for folks interested in gardening for butterflies in particular, that kind of balances that caterpillar and adult life stage.